So we started, talking last time about, the Chicago fire and how that, destroyed the commercial district, the Loop, completely, as well as a number of other neighborhoods on the southwest side and especially on the River North side as well. And while that did not lead directly to what we now know as the Chicago School of Architecture, there was a time lag. The city was essentially rebuilt much the same way it had been built before, with 5, 6-story buildings as kind of the top level, as far as somebody could walk up the stairs, and in a very similar architectural style to what had been existing before. Um, it brought in all these architects from largely from the East Coast, but they came to Chicago because there was a lot of work here. There was a lot of rebuilding to do. The 1870s were kind of an economic downturn in the country. There was a major recession, and this really provided a great source of employment and opportunity for especially young architects that were eager and ambitious and willing to relocate to the Midwest. And that would lead, many of these architects are the same ones that came here after the fire, would become the prominent architects of the Chicago School. So I wanted to start first, though. What the main thing that comes out of the Chicago School is the high rise, the skyscraper. And I wanted to start with just some questions for you guys, if you would. We talk about skyscrapers, but what makes a skyscraper? And that's the mile-high skyscraper design that Frank Lloyd Wright did in the 1930s, 20s or 30s, I think it was. But what is it that makes it a skyscraper, a building a skyscraper? Anyone?
It has to
How
be
would
the
you
height,
define
right?
a skyscraper? Yeah, height, right? Okay. But is 15 stories a skyscraper, or what makes it? How tall does it have to be in your mind, maybe, or is there some kind of rule that would apply?
Is it over 40? 40 stories or something like that?
Yeah, so yeah, it could be the number of stories, but of course that's really related to the ability to build certain heights over time. So we're going to really start talking about buildings that are much shorter than that. Tim, I think I saw in your text that it's more proportional, right? If it's taller than it is wide, it looks, then it has more verticality to the building. And that's actually a really good way of thinking about a high rise or a skyscraper. You could build a 40-story building that's really super wide and it wouldn't necessarily look proportionally right. What about other things that would have to, that would go into skyscrapers? Hint, right? We only had, we talked about having only 5, maybe 6-story buildings because you had to walk up, right? So what's a key thing that would be necessary for a skyscraper?
Elevator.
Elevators, yeah, a couple of you said the same thing. Right, this is one of the key innovations that would really launch the ability to do a skyscraper. Is you've got to get people up, whether it's 15 stories or whether it's 40 stories or more, you've got to get people up and down in a quick, efficient, safe manner. And that's an industrial revolution, technology that comes about in the late 19th century. What else? Think about what it takes to build a skyscraper. Foundations, yeah, it's, you got a tall building, that's a lot of weight, it's a lot to support. So you've got to have really good foundations. In fact, that's one of the innovations that comes out of Chicago, because of Chicago built on a swamp. You sometimes hear about, the scam of, hey, I got some swampland to sell you. Well, in Chicago, you take that bet because it's, the loop value properties are pretty expensive, but it was literally built on a swamp with really poor, there's no bedrock, to sort of anchor into. And so the Chicago architects and engineers, as they were building taller and taller buildings, they actually had to figure out some very innovative ways of creating foundations. We don't go into a lot of detail about that in our class, but it's a major element of what makes it possible to build these tall buildings. What about as you get taller and taller? Look at Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High design here. Imagine something else, structurally speaking, that has to occur or has to be dealt with. I'll give you a hint. What's the nickname of Chicago?
Yep, wind.
Wind, right. So wind loading, and the nickname has more to do with the hot air of Chicago's boosters. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Columbian Exposition. But it is windy here off the lake, right? And the taller you go, the more you get, high winds at higher elevations. And that has to be countered. You have to have a structural system that can not only be supported by a foundation and support the weight of the structure itself and the loads, but you have to counter those wind loads. It's not really typically something we have to deal with on a lower rise structure unless you live in hurricane-prone Florida or something like that. So here's some of the things, I think we talked about most of these then, that really are innovations and technologies that have to occur in order to get to a skyscraper and help to define what makes something a skyscraper. So the next question is, okay, we can build it. Why? Why would we build these tall buildings? Someone other than Tim and Joman.
I just feel like you can have a lot of occupancy, and it's not gonna take a lot of space on the land. It's just gonna go higher. And
Yes, very good, Awana. So, you can fit a lot of people in a tall building, and you actually touch on two things, right? Is you have all those people, or density on a smaller plot of land, which becomes really important as land values increase. And in a place like New York City, which is confined to Manhattan Island, on essentially all four sides. In Chicago, which the loop is really confined, you got the lake on the east, you got the river on the north and sort of west of the loop. That really helps to confine the sort of central commercial district. And some other cities don't have the same problem, but it certainly, land values become increasing. What about anybody have other ideas on why people would build high rises?
Maybe a little more romantic idea, but because you can. Now we have technologies that weren't available before, so we can. So why not try to build up instead of horizontal?
Yeah, Giovanni, you could refer to that as the mountain climbing excuse, right? It's there, so we're going to climb it because it's there. And that's actually a good one. And the technologies allow people to do it, so they're going to like, hey, let's do this. And it kind of leads into one reason, which is bragging rights or the prestige of a developer who could say, hey, that's my building there, and it's the feature of the skyline. And I think we're seeing that a lot today. We'll talk more when we get into more contemporary architecture, but if you look at some of the high rises in the Middle East or in the Far East, there's no land issues there. They've got lots of flat arid desert to build in many of these places. So some of it is definitely just the idea of prestige, of putting themselves on the map, of attracting attention. So that's another good reason. So a couple other are that maybe weren't talked about. It's high rises aren't cheap by any means, and especially the taller you go, there's a lot of structural issues to deal with. But if it can be cheaper to build one tall building than to build, one really large building, not just because of land values. And as we start to look into a more corporate era, right, corporate business era, when we have bigger and bigger businesses that emerge in the late 19th and especially into the 20th century, there's a lot of people that they need to fit into offices. And this is a way to do that without spreading out really wide. And the other thing is, kind of going back to our lecture on the 19th century industrial, is you can start to build these buildings pretty quickly and inexpensively in many ways, because we can do it with modern technologies of iron framing, later steel framing, and ultimately what we'll be talking about today, the curtain wall system, where you just hang a facade off a structure that is completely separate. Building prior to the Industrial Revolution, to the advent of essentially cast iron and later steel, was load bearing, and we'll talk about the sort of transition between that in these early Chicago school high rises. So the first building that I want to talk about is from 1879. It's known as the first Lee building. There were several iterations of the building, so this is the first one designed. And William LeBaron-Jenney is the architect. Now, we've talked about him a little bit. He was very prominent in the development in some of the early houses in Riverside. I think he was also the architect for, the George Gilbert house that I showed you, my great-great-grandfather's house in Riverside. But he was, despite sometimes often, designing in more romantic revival styles that we had talked about, he was a pretty innovative fellow. He was really trained as a structural engineer, and that was pretty common for architects in the 19th century. There weren't a lot of architecture programs in colleges, so most architects got some engineering training, and then maybe apprenticed with other architects. He had an education from Paris, which was the preeminent place to learn about engineering and architecture in the world. So if you had the means, you were a young man, at that time it was men, looking to get into architecture engineering, the place to go, if you could afford to, was to go to Paris. And that they were much more traditional. They were still doing the neoclassical architecture, that we've talked about. But he began experimenting with these new structural innovations and new materials, with how to, adapt that to new building types. And with the Leader building, we really see the first time that we begin to merge the two types, the two factors, this engineering and this new materials and structural system, with how do you, what is that going to mean for architecture? When we talked about 19th century industrial architecture, remember we talked about the fact that they were still mostly cladding buildings in old traditional styles with heavy masonry, often load-bearing masonry, even if some of the structural systems like the train stations or that library in Paris had this new innovative technology, because that's what people expected. But the big difference here in Chicago is the fact that we start to see the architects say, hey, we got this new engineering and this new structural system. The architecture ought to start to represent that. And here at the Leader building, we see a building that is what you might think of commonly now today, right, as a loft-style building, where there's some masonry, but there's a lot of windows. And this is something that is the fundamental change that can occur with this new structural framing system, using iron and steel to create a structural frame rather than load-bearing masonry. And that is, you now can have almost no solid walls. You can open that up to lots and lots of glass, which means lots and lots of light. And this is important because this is still an era before electricity. Thomas Edison hasn't invented the light bulb, and electricity isn't, a common thing yet. And so people are still using, whale oil candles and lanterns, and in some case natural gas lanterns to illuminate interiors. And so the more light you can get, the better off you're going to be. And of course, there's no air conditioning, so on hot days you have to open the windows and hope for the best breeze you can get. And so the more windows you have that you can open up and for the light, the better off you are. And I think you can see with the Leader building here, as early as 1879, this is the opportunity to do that. Here is a drawing of some of the structural framing that occurs here. On the left is the leader building, and they're comparing it with a building I'll show you in a minute, which is the home insurance building. And you can see that, we'll look at the one on the left, there's a vertical column. It's a tube, it's this cast iron mostly, and then there are some, you know, steel beams that connect into that, and these can support, you know, the masonry exterior of the wall, and they also provide the structure for the floor loading and all of that, the roof framing. It's very similar at the home insurance building. The structure is a little more beefed up here. The building's getting taller. You're going to have a little more structure. But this is the innovation that started with that, you know, bridge over the River Severn, that cast iron bridge we talked about a couple weeks ago. This is now, how can we apply that technology to architecture and start building taller buildings? And so here's another drawing of the facade. So there's still going to be masonry, and part of that is because of the Chicago fire. They realized that cast iron would melt, and I think I talked about that. And you know, it didn't burn, but it melted, and when it melted, the building collapsed. And so the building codes that emerged out of the Chicago fire required any iron or steel framing to be fireproofed with, at that time, they wrapped it in masonry, because the masonry would absorb the heat, and it would take much longer before that heat then radiated into the iron or steel frame buried inside of that. And so we still see a lot of masonry, and of course they're still using, you know, some traditional load-bearing techniques, but we see a little bit of iron framing the mullions between the windows, and this would allow a wider lintel, right, between the heavy columns. These two piers on the left and the right are where your major columns are, and you've got a lintel coming across there. These piers in the middle would allow for a little bit wider lintel framing so that you could have more windows, and then all of that is essentially filled with windows, with glass. And that's a big deal. This is a major leap forward in architecture that we really hadn't seen much before. And here is a photo of that intact. So you can see the heavy masonry piers and, you know, a little bit over the lintel, but then the rest of it is basically windows with just a little bit of a slender iron frame in between there to allow, you know, as much open window area as possible. So the other building I was referring to is the home insurance building. This was built between 1883, finished by 1885, also by Jenny. And a lot of people call this the first skyscraper. There's been some new technology or some new research, and scholars have sort of backed off of that a little bit in more recent eras. But it certainly is one of the first buildings in the world to begin to rise up to a higher level and to incorporate the things we talked about on what makes it a skyscraper. It has an elevator, it has largely an iron frame, not 100%, and it has a lot more of an exterior skin, what we call a curtain wall. We call them curtain walls because they hang like curtains from a frame, right? They're not part of the window frame, you know, system itself. They're just hanging off that frame, and that's where the term curtain wall comes from. There's still a lot of masonry, and some of it is load bearing, so it isn't quite, you know, the steel frame curtain wall system that I'll show you in a moment. But just like the leader building, there's still a lot of window area, not quite as much as in the leader building, but still quite a bit of open window areas. And then it actually got some additions on the top floors. You can see the original cap of the building was where these arched windows were, and then I don't know, a decade or two after that, they added a few more floors on top of that. Here is a rendering of the original design, and so you can see how the top floor would have been these arched windows, and there would have been a cornice on top. Still kind of a traditional architectural designs, somewhat Renaissance inspired, with symmetry and some Roman arches and the heavy cornices that essentially we were talking about with Italian palazzos back at the beginning of the semester. This is a photo. This building was torn down in 1931 to make way for an even taller skyscraper on LaSalle Street, the Marshall Fields building, or the Field building. It wasn't for Marshall Fields, but the estate or whatever of the late Marshall Field had this built in the 30s. But when they were tearing it down, a number of researchers studied the framing because it all of a sudden was exposed. And this is kind of what led to for a long time, the claim that this was really like the first skyscraper in the world. Like I say, it's, there's some debate about that now as to whether it really should be called a true skyscraper or not. But these are some of the details that came out of some of those discoveries, where there's an iron post or column that was at the beams and the corners, or at intermittent, and then you can see the masonry that gets wrapped around it. That's really, in many ways, that's the fireproofing. The reason why there's some question about this building is there's talk about the fact that some of this masonry is still bearing loads, and therefore it's a hybrid. But you can see some of the steel beams and girders that would then support, the floor framing. You can see a little bit of that here on the right. The lintels of the windows were sort of iron and steel. That is a great technology, as we talked about with the Leader building, that would help open up more window area. There was another gentleman, Leroy Buffington, from the same time, and he was out of Minneapolis, and he was devising schemes for tall buildings as well, and even created a sort of a generic scheme for a high-rise building in 1881, even before the home insurance building. And he actually got some patents, from the federal government on some of his ideas and innovations. But he wasn't a prolific builder, and so he had ideas, but he didn't build many of them, and so he often got passed over. But there were a lot of people thinking about this around this time. He even had this harebrained scheme that you could build what he called stratosphere scrapers. They might rise 30 stories into the air, and people in the 1880s thought he was wacko, right? Like, you can't take this guy seriously. There's no way we're going to be building 30-story buildings, So he was sort of ridiculed a little bit in the press and in the publicists because of some of these ideas. Well, of course, reality is, we're building taller buildings than that now. So he was just a little bit ahead of his time. So another really early and prominent building that is maybe questionable as to whether it should be called a high-rise or a skyscraper by some of the definitions we talked about, but certainly is an important building in the development of the high-rise, and that's the Auditorium building in Chicago. The construction of this took 4 years, started in 1886, finished in 1890, and the design firm was Adler and Sullivan. So Louis Sullivan, that I'm sure you've all heard of, he's often called the sort of father of the skyscraper, and we'll talk a little more about him and his contributions in a moment. But really, Sullivan and the firm Adler and Sullivan, they were one of many architects, especially in Chicago, working on this. I'll show you some other examples by other firms. But Sullivan, as we'll talk about, really helped to refine the design of a high-rise. He was a designer more than he was an engineer or whatever. So some of his philosophies come about during the design work and what a tall building ought to be, as we'll be discussing. In the 1890s, in 1993, the firm broke apart due to a recession, and so he was independent, had independent commissions after that. But after 1904, he had some problems with alcohol, and some personal issues, and kind of went into a decline. And so really for the last 20 years or so of his life, he kind of was, scraping by, and ultimately died pretty penniless, in obscurity. And some of his colleagues, like Frank Lloyd Wright, had to sort of scrape together enough money to just give him a decent burial and tombstone at Graceland Cemetery. His partner was Dagmar Adler, and Adler was the older partner, the senior partner. He brought on this young, upstart who had come to Chicago after the fire and was immensely talented, and he recognized that, and he made him a partner ultimately. But Adler was you might say, the sort of businessman behind the firm. He had a lot of connections and was really good at getting clients and keeping them happy, which is sometimes an underrated aspect of architecture. You can design these incredible, wonderful, beautiful buildings like Sullivan could, but if you can't keep your clients happy, and if you can't get new clients, then you're going to struggle. And ultimately, that's what happened to Sullivan after the firm broke up. Adler was a Jewish man, and he had a lot of, in the Jewish community as well, but he really was he was a brilliant engineer and also got the commission for the auditorium theater because of his abilities with acoustics and engineering. The auditorium was a building that was going to be this massive, performance hall, as you can see in the floor plan down here at the bottom. But at the time, it was thought that, well, we need some income, beyond just the, selling tickets. And so they thought, well, let's build a hotel and offices that would provide sort of a steady stream of rent, right, and income for the opera itself. And that would be a way to pay for it, in addition to just having a giant opera house. And, a very practical solution, very Chicago kind of, hey, let's not just take up a lot of land area for a big auditorium theater. Let's put some offices in here. Let's, have a hotel. And they can all be built on top of this thing. And in fact, there was a significant amount of structural innovation in order to build over top of this huge wide open space here. And you can see it in the section, it cuts through a big chunk of the building. There's some high-rise, office and hotel on both sides, but there's also some stuff built over top of that. I think I have another section coming up later that will show you that. So when Adler and Sullivan get the design, they have this project. It's going to be massive. It's going to be one of the largest buildings in volume ever built. And there was a lot of, how do we design this? How do we make something architectural out of this? And if you remember when we were talking about the revival styles, I ended with this, the Marshall Field Warehouse store from 1885. This was by H.H. Richardson, and it's a big warehouse, essentially. It's since been torn down, unfortunately, but Richardson was working in that Richardsonian Romanesque revival style, and big Roman arched windows, that sort of get smaller and smaller as you go up the height of the building. It's not a high rise by any means, but and it's a masonry building. It's essentially a load-bearing masonry building here. But it really was the inspiration in many ways to Louis Sullivan. He actually created almost I wouldn't call it a copy. In fact, in many ways, I think this is a more refined derivative of the Marshall Field Warehouse. This is the Walker Warehouse from 1886, about the same time he's working on the auditorium building. And you can see that he's doing a similar thing here. He's got these big Roman arches down at the bottom. He's got big arched window here in the sort of the mid-span, and then the smaller windows up top. But what he's getting rid of, he's getting rid of some of the rustication of the stone. It's a smoother cut stone. He's simplifying many things. He's getting rid of some of the ornament and decoration that Richardson had put on here. And he does a similar thing with the auditorium theater, really taking that Marshall Field Warehouse as his inspiration there. So he's got a little bit hidden behind the bus here, but down at the bottom you can see these huge Roman arches for the entranceway. And then in the mid-span of the building, we have these big, tall Roman arched window bays, and then smaller arched bays above that, and then the little square windows at the very top. So very much, and again, not a perfect copy, but very, very much inspired by the Field Warehouse by Richardson just a few years earlier. So I had talked in that previous lecture about how Richardson was a massive influence to the Chicago School modern architects, even though he was working in a revival style. Here we see how Sullivan takes that revival style form and he transforms it into something that is more modern. So we're getting rid of the more direct associations with Romanesque architecture, but the form is still there. He's just getting rid of some of the foo-foo, although the base is still that rusticated stone that we see at the Marshall Field Warehouse. Here's a nicer view of the front facade on Michigan Avenue. This is now Roosevelt University, so the auditorium is still there. You can still go to performances there, but the old hotels and offices are now really part of the university. But you can see these massive arched openings down at the bottom, and you see the masonry, these Roman arched openings on the top. But otherwise, it's a fairly modern building. Here's a view of the auditorium itself. Again, this was a major accomplishment. It's a huge space to create. Adler was instrumental in designing the acoustics for this space. A young apprentice working for Adler and Sullivan at the time had a heavy role in doing a lot of the details and decorating on this. His name was Frank Lloyd Wright. We're going to talk a little bit about Wright later, to say the least. So this was the project that he really cut his teeth on when he was still a young man working, learning the trade. This is a view of the main lobby. No, they had really good. Bea asked if there was sound issues from the auditorium because of the other elements of the building around it, and they did very good insulation and soundproofing to separate. The acoustics in the hall are considered to be some of the best, even today. Our best acoustics in here, and that's partly, again, the brilliance of Adler, who had an expertise in that. So this is the lobby of what is now Roosevelt University. As you can see there, this would have been the hotel lobby originally. And you can see some of those same big Roman arches are included, on the inside as well. A lot more ornamentation on the inside. A lot of this is stuff that Frank Lloyd Wright worked on. And we'll talk a little bit about the ornament later, but the ornamentation by Sullivan tends to be more organically inspired through nature. Rather than looking back at previous architectural histories of of Greek or Roman or Egyptian or something like that, and that's part of what makes a lot of this architecture modern. This is known as Gans Hall. This is a lecture hall space inside the building, and it's not usually very accessible. I was able to go to a lecture here a few years ago, and before they, while they were setting up and stuff, I took a whole bunch of photos because it's been beautifully restored, but it's not typically open to the public. And this is a beautiful space of Sullivan's design work, again with Frank Lloyd Wright helping him out with many of the details here. Here is a nice detail of some of the art glass windows. We still see those Roman arches, but again, there's no direct connection between a historical style of the past. So, unlike Richardson, he's not referring back to a Romanesque architecture per se. He's not, reviving Greek architecture or Gothic or Roman or Egyptian. They're creating something that at least ornamentally is modern. It's inspired by nature, generally speaking here, rather than an architecture of the past. Here's a nice detail of the the light fixture. You know, electrical lighting by the late 1880s is a new thing, so this would have been pretty innovative at the time to have an electric light fixture. They called them electroliers at the time, and they just had these little light bulbs sticking out. But Sullivan's like, yeah, you know, let's not just put a light bulb in a socket. Let's make it something decorative. Let's make it something interesting to look at. And so you really see a beautiful sort of combination of modern technology of the electricity and the light bulb with something much more decorative here. Here's another section showing, you know, the big auditorium space here. And then if you look right at the top here, this is Gantz Hall that we just saw, this little space right in here. A lot of above the auditorium is courtyard, but they have some building elements, including this fairly large lecture space. And you can see there's a lot of trusses that go into framing the roof over the auditorium and even allowing this building on top of that. This is really, really innovative structural technology for the 1880s. All right, so some other examples by another firm that was, frankly, just as, if not more prominent than Adler and Sullivan in this era, and that's Burnham and Root. This is the Rookery building from 1888, so it's a contemporary to the auditorium building. This is a famous photo of Daniel Burnham on the left and John Welburn Root on the right there. Burnham and Root were another firm. These were Easterners that came out after the fire, really cut their teeth, started doing residential designs mostly for some prominent Chicagoans. Daniel Burnham married the daughter of a very wealthy Chicago, I forget if he was, I think he was an industrialist or something like that. So he had some strong connections. He married well, I guess you could say. It gave him a lot of clients. So he was kind of the businessman of the firm. And Root was the designer. So if you're thinking, comparing to Adler and Sullivan, they're similar in that regards. Although Burnham was actually pretty talented as an architect as well. But Root was one of the most talented American architects ever. He actually was a very good engineer. He developed a number of engineering solutions for his buildings, and especially for the foundations in the swampy Chicago soil. But he was a immensely talented designers, and unfortunately died young. I'll talk about that a little later in the lecture. But really, this firm is one of the most prominent in developing the high-rise in Chicago. So here's an image. This is a historic view soon after it would have been finished in 1888. And really was one of the first buildings to incorporate all these different technologies and elements that create a high-rise. It's still a bit squat compared to its height. It doesn't look like it's a big, tall, soaring building, but it's almost cube in dimensions. But it incorporates a lot of iron framing. On the back side, the facade is almost a full curtain wall, even though the main primary facades are still heavy masonry and look like there's some load-bearing aspects of the masonry there. Here is a modern view of it. This is on LaSalle Street at Adams, still intact. Been beautifully restored back in the late 80s, early 90s by my former boss, Gunny Harbo. It's a sort of a red brick and terracotta building. He's also influenced by Richardson and the Romanesque sort of inspiration of the Marshall Field warehouse. Here is a big arched entryway down here, and again we see the sort of big wide bays with Roman arches. He doesn't break them down quite as much as Richardson and Sullivan did, but at the very top we have the smaller windows, and then we have a big heavy cornice, which was pretty typical of the time. Here's a nice detail of some of that masonry work. Again, very much more organically inspired ornamentation, not looking back at earlier architecture in how it's decorated or designed. And here's a great view of the arched entryway. He was also inspired by Islamic decoration. Some of this detailing, especially flanking the doorway down here, is very Islamic inspired from mosques and buildings we talked about in the fall, like the Alhambra. Here is a floor plan. Now, the Rookery is a great project to really talk about Chicago office buildings. And these were similar in New York City as well, that being developed around the same time. And again, we talked about the fact that electricity was a brand new thing, and some of these buildings didn't even have electricity initially. So you need a lot of light and you need a lot of ventilation. And the solution was to create often donuts. So there would be a big light court in the center, and that would make you'd have a central corridor that would go around, and you'd have offices on the outside perimeter, and you'd have offices on the light court side. So if you wanted a more expensive, if you tenant, you had a little more prestige or something, you would get a little higher rent on the outside offices. But if you needed a cheaper rent or something, you could have an inside office, and your view would only be of the light court, not very fancy, or of the alley or something like that. But it was a great way, to mix, higher end tenants and, up and coming tenants that didn't have the means and resources. There's going to be elevators. So here, sort of at the center bottom, is the elevator lobby. You can see there's 6 elevators serving this building. And that's going to be important if you're going to have the Rookery is probably around 12 to 14 stories tall. I forget the exact number. There's fire stairs. You got to have some kind of emergency egress. So there's a stair over in this upper left corner here. There's also a grand stair that's really famous. I'll show you an image of that in a minute. But these are all important to get your ventilation, to get light and circulation. All of these things are critical for these late 19th century commercial office buildings. So here's a view of the light as it appears today. When the building was renovated, they put a modern skylight on the top so that the interior now is a more hermetically sealed space. You'll see in a moment that the skylight was lower down just over the lobby space. So in the past, you would have been able to open these windows and get some ventilation in. Nowadays, it's all air conditioned, and so it just made more sense to close it off up at the top. And you can see on the far left is the Oriel stair that we saw on the floor plan. And let me go back here. You look at this, this is very similar to what we just saw with the Leader building, right? There's some masonry and there's some masonry piers, but otherwise it's almost all windows. And that's a continuation of what we had originally saw with the Leader building in 1879. This is a historic view of the main lobby light court. So you would walk in that arched entryway that we saw a couple slides back. You'd walk past the elevator lobby into this grand space, and this was the original skylight over top of that. And really, this would have been almost like an indoor shopping mall. Around the perimeter would have been shops and storefronts where office workers could have, gotten a haircut or done their dry cleaning, or looks like there was a travel agency here. You could go to Mexico. This was a great way to incorporate both retail and office space into the city. And you can see it was really ornamented. These chandelier type light fixtures, these iron fixtures with the little light bulbs, were similar to kind of what we saw with what Louis Sullivan did at the auditorium building in one of those last slides. Actually, what happens though is in 1905, this was considered already pretty outdated, just a few decades on. And so the building owners in 1905 hired now more prominent Frank Lloyd Wright, who had was more successful at this point, to remodel that light court and to modernize it, update it. Didn't want that sort of old Victorian looking lobby. They wanted something new and modern, and I think even today it's been beautifully restored. It still looks really new and modern. It gives you an early sense of just how modern Frank Lloyd Wright was. And so you can still go into the light court today. The Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio, the Preservation Trust, they call themselves. They run the home and studio tours, but they also do a tour of the Rookery in normal times. So if you have not been in this space, I very much encourage you to do this. You don't even have to take a tour. You can walk into the lobby. You can go in some of the different shops that are here. You can't really walk up the stairs and stuff if you're not on a tour, but just walk into this space. And I encourage you to do that. It's an incredible space. Here is a view, very famous photograph. This is my photo, but there's famous photos of this Oriel stair that you see, published. It's a incredible geometries here by Root. Here's a little bit of detail. They call it the Rookery because after the fire, this was like the temporary home of Chicago City Hall, and there was a water tank on top, and it became like a nesting of birds, and people were calling it the Rookery before the building was built. And so when that got replaced with this building, people just kept calling it the Rookery. So that's the name that stuck. And you may recognize the guy, much younger, about 25 years younger in the bottom slide here. It's a great place for a party. This was our wedding reception for me and Melissa. So she makes another appearance. She's showing up on some of the slides. So this is us on that Oriel stair. And then this is us coming down the grand staircase at our reception. It was really an amazing. I had not worked on this. My boss had done it a few years before I started working with him, but it's a special place in my heart, and we wanted to have our reception here, and it was pretty incredible walking down the stairs in the space. So kind of a cool little look at Doug when he was 25 years younger. All right, so another building before we break for the day, also by Burnham and Root, is the Monadnock building. So this is from 1891. So this is really an era when a lot of these technologies that are emerging in the late 1870s and definitely in the 1880s have kind of coalesced and come together. But the Monadnock building is an unusual building because it's a bit of a throwback. It is almost, at least the exterior walls are all load-bearing masonry. And this is basically because their client really, who was out of Boston, it was a developer out of Boston, and they're like, yeah, we're not sure we trust this newfangled iron and steel construction technology that you guys have been working on in Chicago. We're a little more comfortable with having a masonry building. That's the way buildings ought to be built, and that's what we want. So Burnham and Root said, well, okay, if that's what you want, we can do it. And so it actually winds up being the tallest load-bearing masonry building in the world, and it's the last building that's kind of a tall building that's going to be built out of masonry like this. Now, some of it's still, there's some iron frame on the inside, and then it was added on. This is the original wing here in the foreground. You can see how the cornice changes halfway down the building. That's a later addition, and by that time, in the late 1890s, when it was added onto, the client said, oh yeah, okay, we trust it. Go ahead and build it out of iron. So it's a little different. It's a good way to see the contrast there. But I really like to point this building out because this shows that evolution, that change. And it's actually, ironically, despite the fact that it has an archaic structural system, load-bearing masonry, it's probably one of the most modern of the early Chicago high-rises because it's almost devoid of any ornament whatsoever. It's almost like a little preview of the mid 20th century high-rises that are going to come, especially in Chicago in the mid 1900s. Here is a rendering of it, just the original portion without that addition to the left by Burnham and Root from 1891. And this photo shows you the problem with doing load-bearing masonry on a tall building. This is a window at the ground floor, and the walls are 6 feet thick here. Because the taller you go at load-bearing masonry, the more weight you have, especially with masonry. Masonry is very heavy, and so you've got to have a very, very thick wall to support that. The Gothic builders figured out things like flying buttresses and stuff to try to sort of get more light and air and have a little thinner walls and bigger window openings. But we're not going to have high-rise buildings with flying buttresses here. So we get really, really thick walls at the base. But what makes this such a modernist design is because it as it goes higher, the walls get thinner. And that's a reality of the structural reality, right? At the base, it has to be really, really thick, but the further up you go, the thinner the wall can be. You're not supporting as much load. And so if you stand at the corner of Jackson and Dearborn, you can literally see the building getting narrower and narrower as you look up. It's not just an optical illusion, and there's no decoration on this building. The developer was, Burnham and Root kept designing this building with a bunch of ornament, and the developer kept sending it back and saying, then, and not by email, by basically messenger service, which had to go send on a train. So we're talking about a few days of time between communications. And the developer kept saying, no, there's still too much ornament on this building. I don't want to have to pay for all that. They were the developer, already of saying, I want the building cheap, I built quick, I don't want all this extraneous foo-foo on it. And so, eventually one night, the story goes that Burnham was working late. John Root had already gone home, and he was struggling with it. He's like, we still got to have some ornament on this building. And Burnham, the practical guy, said, all right, look, if the client doesn't want any ornament, I'm just going to take all the ornament off. We're just going to give them a raw building. And sure enough, that's what we got. And this was unusual still for the 1890s. But would become obviously really common in the mid 20th century. So again, the irony of being this archaic construction, but really one of the most modern designed buildings of the 19th century. And I think that's a good place to stop.